just coordinating with them?
Just now. To be fair, we were throwing.
Hello. All right, everyone, welcome. Welcome to our joint work session of County Board, School Board, and the Joint Facilities Advisory Commission. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague on the school board chair, Nancy, to say a first few words, and then I'll say a couple, and then we'll move through the agenda.
Thank you. Good evening, fellow board members, and particularly to the county board. Thank you for inviting us to your home, the county manager and superintendent, and everybody who's here. Thank you for being here for this important topic. So I do want to speak on behalf of my board of the school board to say that we're pleased to participate in this joint board meeting to receive and discuss the Joint Facilities Advisory Commission Phase 2 status report and recommendations. We're grateful for the thorough work that's been done by all the members of JFAC on the two projects that JFAC was asked to consider first and will report out on today, the Buck property and the Virginia Hospital Center site. We look forward to discussing JFAC's next steps in working with both county and schools to provide input into the long-range school and county facilities plans to meet our growing community needs. Per the November 9th, 2016 joint charge, JFAC's overall mission is to provide input to the boards on capital facilities needs assessments, capital improvement plans, and long-range facility planning for both the Arlington County government and Arlington Public Schools. We thought it was important to remind ourselves at this point what our roles and responsibilities are, so I'm just kind of going through that really quickly. The work of this group will assist the schools, us, and the county in developing our respective capital facilities needs assessments using county and schools trend, forecast, and projection data, all three. JFAC's work is intended to inform both the county and the schools' capital improvement plans over the course of our two-year CIP cycles. APS will begin its CIP cycle this year. JFAC is to have a special emphasis on collaborative projects that provide opportunities to maximize public benefit through county schools' joint partnerships, particularly including options for co-location, joint or shared use, adaptive reuse, and efficiencies in construction timing. And we believe more and more we will be unable to do any projects without that kind of joint collaborative work. As is also stated in the charge, the school board is very interested in the special emphasis on long-range planning for future county and APS facilities based on the analysis of latest trends, forecasts, and service delivery models. We're grateful for the work JFAC has done also on community engagement. It's been really impressive. That's also part of its charge and its collaboration with existing advisory councils like our Facilities Advisory Council. In APS and our schools community, I need to say that we often feel like the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to planning for facilities, because we must meet the needs of every student that comes to our schoolhouse doors in our growing, increasingly urban, 26-square-mile community. We need more space to accommodate our tremendous growth. Our schools are at maximum capacity, and we no longer have easy places to expand, develop, or build new schools. We must work hand in hand with the county to meet our facilities needs. We understand this work is complex, sensitive, and will take great coordination. We must work collaboratively with you, with the county, in any future project to find locations for our new schools. For this reason, we believe the work of the JFAC is critical as it brings together our staffs, us, and our great community advisors to help us put in place the long-range plans we need to meet both our schools and county facility needs together. We summarized our county schools collaborative work, and you're going to hear that in a few minutes from the manager and the superintendent, and our position on the Buck property and VHC, as well as our support for JFAC's next steps in our June 16th letter to the county board. We look forward to hearing the JFAC's detailed report and have comments to share with you as we go through it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. We have a really robust agenda. We're going to work through the comments from the superintendent and the county manager, get a little background about the collaboration we've had, about the growth and facility needs. Then we'll get the report from JFAC, and then we'll be giving some direction to staff on a couple of items and really paying attention to the JFAC recommendations, and then in giving staff to direction or some guidance to JFAC as well. Let me just say a couple things to lead into that first presentation from Pat and Mark. You know, my experience is that the schools and the county have always worked well together. And we may not always believe it, but it's far more so than almost anywhere else around. We've just done that innately because it was the right thing to do, and we both could benefit. But there's been more of an imperative in recent years because of the growth of the schools, because of the growth of the county. The community facility study was a wonderful way to try to capture some of that, give us a solid grounding and some guidance, as Nancy has said, to go forward. And I thought it did a great job capturing a really important fact in this county, and that is that with our growth, our greatest challenge, our greatest scarcity is land. And that is a primary part of what JFAC is all about. As we go forward, we know it's around co-locating, it's around collaboration, it's around finding more efficient uses of those scarce resources. At the same time, we have a school board separately elected, a county board separately elected. We have a different set of responsibilities in the big picture. The schools have their set of responsibilities and roles. I think we have a healthy tension. I think it's a good thing. It's a positive thing. It's inevitable because we have different roles and responsibilities. But so often when we collaborate, when we tackle these things together, integrate our long-term planning, we're going to find the best results, and that really is usually the best for everyone concerned. So JFAC was very carefully pulled together jointly as well, sort of modeling this. We talked about the criteria, the types of skill sets and representation we were looking for, and you all are very special people, you JFAC members. And part of it is we really wanted people who had an ability to think countywide, to dig into issues and roll with us and guide us and give us some really good thinking for the decisions that we're each going to have to make as we move forward in meeting the community and school facilities that this community will want into the future. So this is our first meeting together. I know I'm going to leave it to Ginger and Greg to ask the JFAC members to stand up, so I'll hold that till later. But again, we welcome our colleagues here, and we welcome all of you to the boardroom, and we have about an hour and 50 minutes to get some good work done. So with that, let me turn to Pat and Mark, if you guys want to do your first presentation with some of this background information.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our school board colleagues. I think, Hope, if you can get the first slide presentation up. Pat and I are going to do a sort of tag team on this presentation. This is, if we can go to the first slide, what we've done here is we've tried to lay out those needs that the county has already identified in its CIP that require locations that have not yet been identified. This is in no way meant to be a full explanation of everything that's in our CIP. And you can see there a lot of these issues, but not all of them have been dealt with by the JFAC. JFAC looked at material staging and art bus parking and police emergency vehicles. We have a separate conversation on county daycare that we're having on our side of the aisle. If you go to the next slide, you'll see, I think, a number of things here, with the exception of the fire stations on the east and west end of Columbia Pike. All those issues have been dealt with by JFAC, and you'll hear more from them on that in the future tonight. So, and we go to the next slide. This is meant to be, again, it says examples. Those things that we've identified currently in our assessment where there will need to be somewhere in the county a location identified at some point in the future. And these are items that are beyond the 10-year timeline for our CIP. So a few examples. Land acquisition, right now we're going through a fairly rigorous process for our Public Spaces Master Plan. It's referred to here as POPS, where they've tentatively identified the need for at least 30 acres of new public space over the next 10 years. We also have a number of sector plans and adopted plans, and here are just some examples. The Affordable Housing Master Plan that talks about locating 12,000 new units in the county of affordable housing, and various elements of the Roslyn Sector Plan that call for locating, in this case, something as small as a bike facility in Roslyn. They're meant to be examples, not exhaustive, but to paint a broad picture when we hear from the superintendent and schools about how there are needs which are very important to the community for locating schools. This is just a sample of some of those needs in the future that the county has. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mark, and I'll echo some of the same sentiments that have been shared. Thank you very much to Greg and Ginger, as well as the members of JFAC, and we appreciate being here. My slides lay out very similar, and this is to the extent our CIP here, with some exceptions with some schools that we're transitioning because of adding to our school inventory. You can see just really quickly looking at the timeline that 2019 we are actually going to be opening or transitioning a total of 5 school facilities. You can also see that this aligns with the enrollment projections as our enrollment continues to grow through the elementary, middle, and transition to the high. You can see that kind of playing itself out. We are also utilizing some of the existing space, and you see that actually at the very top, where we're making some interior modifications to existing space. As Mark pointed out, a lot of the locations that we have identified are existing school facilities or existing space that we have. So as we look forward and transition, similar to what Mark shared with looking out beyond the CIP in the 10 years, and we can go to the next slide, I want to emphasize this is a snapshot of what we anticipate some of those needs are going to be based on some of the projections that we see and the forecast rolling those out, as well as some of the forecasting that has been provided by some outside agencies. And we need to begin this planning process and be prepared given the amount of time that it takes, and also the recognition that these projects are most likely going to require that we collaborate between school and county. So you can see as we look out, the projection for 2 to 4 elementary schools over the beyond the 10-year period, the need for either 1 or 2 middle schools, and then also the need, if we continue on this pace, for a comprehensive or a high school of 2,200 students or more. So this, again, gives us a snapshot. I think the intent of this slide is really to talk about we need to begin to think about these facility needs and how we plan for them and the intricacy that is around them. And I think the JFAC facilitating and moving this to the front of their agenda as they complete this first phase is really a priority that we see. Piggybacking on some of the things, and I'll start this off and then turn it back to the county manager. We look at some of the things that we are collaborating on and working very closely. I'll just kind of identify a few here across a broad section of services. Thankful for with the community service, the ART iRide program and Safe Routes to School. Transportation or multimodal movement around the county becomes critical for all of us, but especially our students and their safety. We also see a focus in relationship to that on adding additional crossing guards, and we are in the process of how we can expand that and support our schools. With the internal efficiencies, while it's not listed here, our work with Connect Arlington. And then we're doing a whole host of facility work with joint use school and community center facilities, as well as sharing of indoor spaces. If you can go and flip to the next slide, I'll just identify some other areas that we are talking about. Also, the installation of relocatable classrooms, especially over summer, comes pivotal to us, starting off on a good foot for the year. And I have to say the county has just been exceptional here. And then also how we are transferring land back and forth between the county and schools has been something that has been very, very helpful to us. So I'll kind of stop there. Mark, I'll let you kind of pick up on some of these services as well.
Right, so there actually is a method to the color coding here, if anybody was curious. It's a questionable method, which people should feel free to criticize at any point in time. But given that these are joint activities, we tried to characterize some things that were essentially were given birth to on the school side. Those would be in the green, and that they're coming to us. And then the things that are, for example, that would be, for example, something related to Taylor School and Zachary Taylor Park, which is an item I think that's on the school board agenda for Thursday evening. An analogous example coming in the other direction would be that we worked very closely with the schools related to the Wilson School. And we have something as simple as says Wilson School Vacation. That is not for the students, but that is rather something related to a land transaction, vacating some property we have there. So I just wanted to conclude by saying one thing which can't be emphasized enough, which is that I often get asked by my department heads when I'm meeting with them why I don't spend more time with them, because I spend most of my time with the schools, and that's not a bad thing. The schools are, I think it was yesterday, the number 1 or 2 developer in the county. They are an incredibly important part of our success story in trying to attract business here. And I'd say at least 40% of my week is devoted to working closely with Dr. Murphy and our colleagues in the schools, and we welcome that. And I would just say to the community, especially those people who are wondering whether we'll be able to meet the challenges in the future, I simply say, look at what we're doing now and we've done over the last few years on this list, and that should give you some level of confidence. So with that, we conclude our presentation.
Okay, thank you. It's a really robust list. I love the way you ended that too, and it should give people confidence. It doesn't mean there won't be challenges and bumps, but we always get through them. Okay, shall we go on to the presentation from our JFAC chair and co-chair on your Phase 2 report and recommendations. Let me introduce Ginger Brown and Greg Greeley. Thank you both very much. It's on. There you go.
Good evening, members of the school board and county board. I'm Ginger Brown. I'm the chair of the JFAC, and this is Greg Greeley, and he's the vice chair. And I want to thank you for having us here this evening to discuss the work of our commission that we've been working on for the past few months. But before I turn it over to Greg to begin our presentation, I wanted to take a minute and to recognize our hardworking JFAC members. Many of them are in the audience. If they could please stand up for a second and wave.
All right, don't be shy.
I also wanted to recognize our very talented and dedicated staff. Many of them, if they could please stand up. And finally, I also wanted to thank and recognize our many community members that have shown up night after night after night after night and have been on this journey with us so far. So thank you to them as well. So now I'd like to turn it over to Greg to begin the presentation, and I'll pick it up in a minute.
Great.
Okay. We'll start with some of the basics. I think this will be a lot familiar to many people in the room here, but we have the JFAC Charter talking about capital facilities, talking about long-term demographic trends and long-range planning, all stuff we've heard already today. But moving on, we got an interesting start. Next slide. Our first thing for our long-term planning was short-term tasks, which seems a bit ironic, but both of the sites that we'll be talking about tonight have very important long-term implications for our community. So we'll be talking a lot more about the Buck site on North Quincy Street. We'll be talking a lot more about the Virginia hospital sites, including the one on Carlin Springs Road, and what could be done there. Next slide. As a reminder, 2015, that's when the Community Facility Study recommended the formation of the JFAC. We had a charter approved in 2016, and both boards then appointed 21 commissioners who immediately launched into our 2 subcommittees to look at Virginia Hospital and the Buck site. So again, very fast and furious pace. There was a lot of work to do, but we do have some background here so that everyone's familiar with why these sites are so important, why the decision is so complex, and why it took us time to get to this point. Starting with the Virginia Hospital Center agreement, it's actually an agreement that our county board has with Virginia Hospital. So Virginia Hospital, at their option, can elect to acquire the Edison site. That Edison site, certainly is very important for the hospital and their future growth. In compensation, if the hospital elects to acquire that site, then we as a community get to select, do we want cash for that site? Do we want to acquire property for that site? Or do we want a combination of the two? Next slide. The Carlin Springs site is the piece of the transaction that's received the most attention. As you see up there, it's a fairly large site, 11.5 acres. And reflecting back on the earlier presentations and the importance of our community acquiring more land for all of the people we anticipate being here in the future, 11.5 acres is certainly an interesting potential acquisition. That is not, however, the only Virginia Hospital site that was under consideration. Next slide. There is a building there, as well as some existing uses at Carlin Springs. The one that's gotten the most attention is the emergency care center, which is something that the hospital has committed to relocating if the county determines that the Carlin Springs site is what they would want to exchange with Virginia Hospital. But there's also a child care facility, a pediatric care facility, and some other community-based services that are there at the Carlin Springs site. Next slide. There are also properties on Lee Highway, 4 of them, both to the north and to the south of Lee Highway at George Mason. These 4 properties have a variety of zoning, and one of the things that is most important to note is that 2 of the properties have easements for cross-sharing the parking. This was actually important in some of our deliberations because it would make it difficult to acquire one property without the other one. Next slide. There are existing buildings and existing leases on these sites. You can see some of the existing uses are a bank branch, a child care facility, a shoe repair, a title loan office, and medical offices. So all of those existing uses have leases on those properties that extend multiple years. And finally, the last 2 properties were on 16th Street North. These were 2 residential properties. They are not adjacent. They are separated. And that was important because what it really meant is that the number of potential uses that these sites could meet were close to none. So that is the sum total of all of the Virginia Hospital properties. Switching to our other subcommittee, we have the Buck property, which is 6 acres on North Quincy. The county has an option to acquire that site. The total price would be $30 million. We have $3 million that has been already put down on the property to retain the option of purchasing that site, and the deadline is the end of November. And so, again, we talked a lot about the need for us as a community to acquire more land. That's very important. It's also very daunting when you look at the cost of land in Arlington and looking at that $30 million figure. Certainly we want to be very confident that in acquiring this property that we can get a good value for that cost of acquisition. Additionally, on the Buck property, the county managers received a proposal from the Arcland company to swap 2.3 acres at Buck for 3.5 acres on Shirlington Road. So that's another piece of this transaction that our subcommittee looked at as part of that transaction. I think it's interesting to note here, we did not look very closely at the Shirlington Road site because there already is the 4-mile run working group that's examining that area. We did, however, receive a letter from them that noted that they were interested in using the Shirlington Road site for bus storage, whether that was acquired through a purchase or through a land swap. So it was interesting to note that that was their thinking for that area. Some more characteristics of the bus site. It is industrial zoned, which has been certainly a point of interest for the possible uses there. It also has a GLUP designation for low residential. The utilities are listed there, and I think the important element with the utilities is the fact that they are very extensive. They cross the site in various directions. They're also anticipated to be very expensive to relocate. So that's going to put some constraints on how the site could be used in the future. There are 4 existing buildings, so we looked at each of the buildings and the potential adaptive reuse for all of those. And the existing uses there include a mixed martial arts, indoor play space, gymnastics, as well as 2 of the office buildings which are currently vacant. In terms of the land swap, you can see there a comparison between the Shirlington Road property and the portion of the Buck property that would be exchanged. The existing uses on the Shirlington property include vehicle storage, and 2.5 acres of that is already leased for bus parking, particularly our art buses. So in a sense, in doing the exchange, that use would persist indefinitely. Some additional site characteristics for Arcland. We mentioned that was 3.5 acres, zoned light industrial. It's got service industry there already, a number of utilities, as well as a resource protection area. And again, as I mentioned, the key existing use there is that we already have our vehicles stored. That's it.
Both of our subcommittees have been piloting the use determination process that was created through the community facilities study. It's a 4-phase process meant to serve as a project management tool. The first phase is to scope the identified use, or it's the discovery phase. Phase 2 is identifying the potential uses for the site. Phase 3 is the evaluation of a short list of sites for more detailed studies on traffic, the environmental considerations, and also cost. And so we have just finished phase 2. So we still have phase 3 to come before any sort of final recommendations after the traffic studies. So in phase 1, we established our subcommittees. We hosted a series of community roundtables. We went on a bus tour to look at all of the various sites. We also included the Arcland site, as well as the Trade Center on our bus tour. We conducted a SWOC analysis, and we established our use considerations and evaluation framework. So photos of our bus tour. We learned a lot about the site. It was mostly to better understand the site considerations. We did not discuss the actual uses on our bus tour. In phase 1, we were also given the list of the 10-year needs, which the superintendent and the county manager sort of talked about earlier. And so we can flip through those. It's a fairly long list. And those included generally when it's needed, why it's needed, and possibly where it's needed, what area of the county. We also hosted a series of community roundtables. We had 12 roundtables held across the country. They were all hosted by our JFAC members, which gave them good opportunity to talk to the public. We had participation of over 250 individuals from 45 different neighborhoods. We heard a lot at those roundtables. We heard that we should be planning jointly for schools to distribute the county services and schools equitably, and we should need to address our population growth. We heard very clearly that the county should acquire the Carlin Springs property in the land swap. We heard that overwhelmingly, and also to explore decking opportunities. We heard from many community members the concerns about industrial uses next to residential neighborhoods, and also that we should be thinking about mixed uses and co-location of our public facilities. And finally, we also heard a lot of concerns about the environmental impacts of industrial uses near residential neighborhoods, also traffic and safety and noise concerns. So in phase one, we did a SWOC analysis, which is a deep dive into the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and constraints of the sites in order to better understand and plan for the issues that were specific to the site. Examples would be closest to the neighbors, limited ingress, egress, resource protection areas, legal covenants, and also sewer pipes and other things that would be hard to move. So then we got to phase two. And this is the phase that we identify the potential uses. So we held subcommittee meetings. The civic associations gave us presentations. We did a 4-part what fits exercise, and we began our use consideration review using our evaluation framework. We used a use consideration and evaluation framework that was a 4-tiered evaluation process. The first tier was a pass-fail. So if, for instance, there was a use that was for a fire station on the western end of the pike, it was crossed off the list to be considered at Buck. It was pass-fail. Then we looked for important characteristics, desirable characteristics, and then tier 4 we haven't done yet because it's coming in phase 3, and that's the more detailed traffic analyses and cost and environmental considerations. So we had 40 different use considerations, and it was meant to be iterative, so we're not completely finished. Then we started our 4-part what fits exercise. It was mostly a space planning and problem solving exercise, so we were required to actually solve some problems and make it all fit. And we used 2 scale pieces to see what fit and how it could fit together. So in the first part, we came up, it was brainstorming, and we came up with 34 different schemes for Buck and 17 different schemes for the Carlin Springs sites. Our second round, or part 2, we removed the Lee Highway sites, and we brought it down to 6 schemes at Buck and 7 schemes at Carlin Springs. And finally, we paired them to make sure that we were solving the problem. So if bus parking wasn't being solved at one, it was being solved at the other. And so we ended up with 5 schemes, 5 at Buck and 5 at Carlin Springs. And so these are just photos of our various space planning exercises, and we looked at all kinds of fields and lots of things. Then we narrowed it. This is Carlin Springs. Part 2, more space planning. And finally, the five scenarios that we ultimately brought to the community forum. So we arrived at these 5 scenarios for what could fit. I would like to point out that the JFAC members had not yet weighed in on what should fit. We wanted to hear from the community directly before we made any recommendations on the scenarios to move forward to phase 3. So believe me, the public did weigh in. When we had a community forum on May 24th. We had 100 participants from 25 different neighborhoods, and we got 750 comments that evening. We also had an open house. The scenarios have been on display at Courthouse for June, but we also received over 500 comments online. And so those... And those comments weighed heavily in our recommendations. So just a quick review that Phase 3 is coming, and so that's what obviously part of the discussion is tonight, that we will be moving on to the more detailed evaluation, and so the schemes that move forward will receive a greater level of detail. So onto the scenarios and the schemes. So Buck A, this is the art bus storage option. It includes the reuse of one of the warehouses for police in the building next to Hayes Park for either county operations for the OEM or Office of Emergency Management or for possible APS needs. It should be noted that the community dislikes the bus parking the most. The JFAC came to the consensus that the bus parking at Buck or Carlin Springs is not the preferred option, only as a last resort. Carlin A proposes a new building for fire reserve and fire logistics. It has APS bus storage, but it should be noted these are just the overflow buses of about 24 that are not, it's not the full fleet. There would be a substantial expansion of the park. This expansion could be passive or active recreation space, so it could have courts or fields. We did not weigh in on that. It should be evaluated based on the recommendations of the Public Spaces Master Plan. Buck B includes the Arcland storage facility in the rear of the property next to Hayes Park. It moves the driveway next to I-66, which would put the most vehicle activity away from the residential area. This option includes a fairly large buffer of green space. Again, this space could be used for courts like pickleball, small courts. This could be designed using the forthcoming recommendations of the Public Spaces Master Plan. It also includes material staging, a police impound lot, police and vehicle equipment, and an area for future needs. Carlin B proposes a new building for the Office of Emergency Management. It has APS bus storage and material staging area, and there's 3 areas: park space, potentially parking for buses, and then DES needs. It should be noted that Carlin B is similar enough to Carlin A that we recommended only one move forward, that being Carlin A, because the Office of Emergency Management can be sited anywhere, including in lease space. Buck C, this option reuses or repurposes all of the buildings on the site for fire and police and school needs. There is an option for schools to use the building next to Hayes Park and the office building in the middle of the property. This option includes adding a green buffer. It is the lowest investment option, so it retains the most flexibility for the future. Buck C is also the most preferred, overwhelmingly, by the community. So it is the recommendation of JFAC that it move forward to Phase 3. Carlin C, this option would allow for temporary use of the site for bus parking, and it would allow for a school, either elementary or middle school, at the point that a decision could be made on whether it could be an elementary or a middle school. It includes an expansion of the park. The park could be passive or active, and there could be fields which could be informed by the forthcoming Public Spaces Master Plan. Buck D has a new access road entrance needed. It has the lease back space from the Arcland proposal for APS bus parking. The rear includes keeping the building next to Hayes Park for APS or OEM. There's a buffer area, and it reuses one of the warehouses for the police vehicles and equipment. During the community forum and through our online feedback, we heard it loudly, that the county should not move forward with the Arcland proposal because the future opportunity cost of losing control of the land. Besides the 7-story building, it doesn't incorporate existing small businesses, including the gymnastics, and there's no design review process. It would preclude building over, and it was seen as precluding building over I-66. So the JFAC could not recommend moving it forward as is. Carlin D included a new building for fire, reserve, and logistics, a police impound lot, and material staging area. Includes an expansion of the park for passive or active recreation, and the scenario includes leaving an unplanned paved space. The community feedback clearly demonstrated a dislike for this scenario. The unplanned paved parking lot appears to be, or was considered to be, a dumping ground for all things undesirable. Buck E is an expensive option without a thorough long-range plan to go with it. It's sort of half-baked. The expansion of Hayes Park is highly desirable, and then, but the new buildings would be expensive, and if we are going to do a long-range plan, we should probably do a real one. Carlin E includes greatly expanding the open space and in the long-range building fields atop bus parking. Again, this would probably require more of a real long-range plan to make this happen. So into our recommendations, we recommend acquiring the Buck and Carlin Springs sites. Narrowing the scenarios for further study, we recommend the Buck scenario C and Carlin Springs scenario A and C move forward. Scenarios that include the Arcland land exchange or bus parking require further study, we believe. We believe that further exploration of the ART and APS bus parking siting analysis should be considered. We also consider the Arcland proposal through the long-term lens and if it moves forward, it should include a mixed set of uses. Studying how to meet APS field needs for the Washington and Lee School beyond the Buck site. There's a lot of issues with the Buck site that would make it very difficult to put fields there in the near term. Plan to improve the transportation options on Carlin Springs Road, coordinate the Buck transportation studies between the Ed Center and the Buck site, and study long-term and complementary uses for both sites. Discussion.
Okay. That was a very efficient 54 slides. Well done. Very well done. Okay, so now we're at a point where all the 10 of us here, and I think the manager and superintendent are available, as are other staff. But I think we'll just open the floor. The focus of the first part of the discussion, I think we'll make on the scenarios that we just heard. So what questions do we have? Some of this may be trying to understand how some of these recommendations came forward in more depth. But I really think it's time to just open the floor with some of your questions or some of your framing of the 10 scenarios that are right before us, because ultimately the county board's got to give some guidance about which of these scenarios we think our staff should be digging further into. So, anyone like to start? Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks very much, school board colleagues, and all the JFAC members, I think, did a phenomenally good job. Our briefing materials are terrific. I attended a couple of the outreach sessions, Greg and Ginger, as you know. Really strong work. So just kind of three questions that relate to the various sites. Buses, storage, self-storage, and decking. So with respect to buses, we've got school buses and art buses. And my question is, how did you analyze whether in a particular scenario there would be space to accommodate art buses versus APS buses? And was there, can you say whether or not there were any, is one use more benign than another? In other words, are school buses more benign because they're seasonal and because it's, beginning of the day, end of the day, whatever?
So we actually work closely with the urban design and research team. So we would go back, we would space plan it, and then they would come back and they worked with DES Transportation to know how big a bus is and how much space it would take. So it was the professional work of staff, if they'd like to comment anymore, on how you would plan for 130 buses at a site. So it was staff's in terms of how big art busing or APS
The amount of space needed for a school bus versus the art fleet was sort of determined by staff. And your question was there any difference in terms of the impact of having one or the other on a site?
Right, and And did that inform your thoughts? I mean, for example, Carlin Springs Scenario C, which has a large portion for art buses and a smaller portion for APS, was that based on the relative need, or was it, or what?
The APS buses, we were only considering the overflow. So most of the buses are parked at the Trade Center, but there was 24 new buses. And so it was a much smaller number of
Footage
buses.
need.
Right. And so the art buses are the buses that we have, but also the buses that are coming based on the MTP. So it's a much larger amount of buses. At the APS, there was a lot of consideration. I think it would be easier to park 24 APS buses than 123 art buses, but it
Yeah.
mostly the volume.
Right, no question about that. I mean, just, plunging right into the relative merits of these various scenarios, one concern I have with Carlin Springs C is that this is a site where where on this drawing, you're showing both APS parking and art bus parking, and yet at scenario C for the Buck property, there's no bus parking at all. So, I mean, there's that equitability dynamic that I'm concerned about, certainly. Let me turn to the self-storage side, and nobody likes, that doesn't sound like anybody really is particularly fond of that option. At the same time, I appreciate, where did the manager go?
They're here. They're in the first row.
I don't know, Mark, if you want to chime in here, but I think one of the foundations for your even rolling out that option was because that it would save us money, and that it would give us ownership rather than a long-term lease down at 4 Mile Run. So I just want to ask, if we leave Arcland on the table, what can we do to inform as to design options, architectural options, activation of the roof, and even activation of the ground floor? In other words, first floor retail uses, a community room or a mini community center, anything like that. I mean, can we be looking at those things?
You guys may have to be rotating at different times, or just pull up another chair if there's one in the room. No, there's no other chair in the room. All right.
I'm willing to give up my chair. So to answer your question, because the property at Buck site, and you feel free to jump in at any point in time, is zoned industrial, and if it were to be used for self-storage, that would be something that would be by right. In other words, if the property were provided to Arcland and they owned it, then they could do what they chose to do. The way to change any of the thing and put any of our desires on there about form or content or design would be through the negotiation over the land swap. So we could make anything a condition of the land swap if the other party's prepared to accept it and put it in the land swap. That would be at the direction of the county board, what kind of restrictions to put in there. So there could be restrictions talking about design, about height, about potential retail uses. Those all would be possible items, but again, as part of any negotiation, you have to weigh that. I think that answered your main question. Did I miss something?
It does. Okay. I don't know, Mr. Greeley or Ms. Brown, do you have anything further to say on that specific topic?
No.
All right. John, can I skip around to some others and come back to you so we get some other questions in?
I'll ask about decking later then.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, let's
Not a
get to the
problem.
decking. It's a little separate. I'll turn to Katie and then Christian. No lights on over there. By the way, if you do want to say something, grab Nancy's attention or mine, or push that button on your...
Excellent. Well, want to begin by just echoing kudos. I think the amount of work that you all have done in general is remarkable, and the amount of community engagement is really commendable, including elements of engagement that maybe are less visible to the general public, such as extensive outreach to commission chairs to ensure that our full network of community advisory groups are well connected to one another, and I know that'll pay dividends as we go. Wanted to ask one question to frame our board conversation about where we end up going with regard to the sites or options we elect with input from our counterparts on the school board for further study. And this is a question actually for our manager staff. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of some of the back of the envelope costs of advancing a given, and I'll say a given site scenario, so not a pair of scenarios, but per site? That phase 3 involves design studies, transportation impact analyses, et cetera. So, I think we love keeping our options open on the board. What would prevent us, for example, from saying, let's go ahead and study, all 6 or all 8 permutations? Give us a sense of the cost of doing that analysis per site. That'd be great.
There's another, yeah, Jennifer, pull that chair up. That's great. We have 3 chairs to rotate to.
So we did take an initial look at the scope of the analysis that would need to be done as part of phase 3. Of course, based on the guidance that the JFAC receives this evening, we'll go ahead and update that information. So this is just an initial kind of estimate of the activities and the time and the costs associated with evaluating at least one scenario. So to start, we would need to look at conducting a traffic impact assessment, environmental assessments, potentially archaeological assessments, looking at the building condition. All of those items would take a fair amount of staff time, consultant support, time in terms maybe 9 to 12 months of work, costing about $500,000. And beyond that scenario, so if you have permutations of the scenario, that would be an additional $250,000 or more.
So I appreciate that. I think it's worth our having that shared context as we start to narrow, right? Because the narrowing will be the thing. The only other comment I wanted to just make was to the second bullet that was on the slide that JFAC presented to us, the first for discussion, about the JFAC review of the county's evaluation or assessment of bus parking options throughout the community. I know, as probably was already clear from Mr. Weissatz's questions, and certainly clear from the JFAC presentation, I think we all feel like bus parking is probably not the highest and best use of any of these sites, or I think most neighborhoods would feel the same way. Given, however, as we had a presentation on our transit development plan, bus parking represents the ability of this county to fulfill its commitment to people, particularly along Columbia Pike. It needs to go somewhere. The county's conducted its extensive analyses, but the JFAC has remaining questions that I think are really good ones that many members of our community share. So I wanted to articulate that and at least voice for 1 of 10 strong support for a follow-up community meeting hosted by the JFAC and led by the JFAC to really assess and scrub the analysis that's been done to date to make sure there isn't some other option hiding out there for our bus for the future. And I think others can weigh in.
This is our third item under number 4, which is the directing staff to work with JFAC to review that assessment. So I don't think there'll be much controversy about that one. Let's go to Ms. Kennan and then over to Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. And Greg, Ginger, thank you. Great work all the way through. Really great presentation. Mr. Lander and I had the privilege of being the liaisons to this process from the school board side and really enjoyed working with you all. And but I do want to fill in some context that we kind of were briefed on along the way, but may have taken some members of our school community and our school board colleagues by surprise in terms of how those the scenarios played out. I do want to mention, I believe it's the case, we've been referring to directing county staff to dig into some of these scenarios, but in fact, these are joint, this is a joint decision-making process. We're both weighing in on which of these scenarios we would like both of our staffs to be digging into more. These are both school and county uses that are being recommended on both sites potentially. So I did want to ask you about the couple of points where the schools are included on the site. So the first is on the Buck. It was in 3 scenarios, A, C, and D, but I think C is the one that's most favored. Buck C, in that building next to Hayes Park, you have a potential school site. And I believe that idea really came from the community. that science-focused parents, and now we've also received a letter from the science-focused PTA president being very interested in that site. Could you just talk a little bit about how, I know you have two different possibilities on that, labeled on that building. Could you just talk a little bit more about what you're envisioning for how that might be used for the schools?
This is Buck C.
So we had public comment at the beginning of every meeting and at the end of every meeting, and we had a lot of science-focused parents attending our meetings, not just because of schools, but also because they're neighbors, and so they were concerned with what we were doing, just period. And so they came every night, and they, along the way, I can't remember exactly when the idea came up, but that the school enrollment process was happening in a parallel process, and they asked us to consider using the building for a upper elementary school for science focus. And soon thereafter, we got correspondence from the school board saying, yes, please consider using the building as an upper, or for APS needs.
Yeah.
And so it was an easy thing to do because we had potentially put the Office of Emergency Management, which we had been discussing, could be put anywhere else. So as far as space planning that we were doing, it worked well. So is that?
Yeah, thank you. And then I also wanted to ask in general about Buck. You were not able to fit fields, which was one of the items that we were very interested in, knowing especially that W&L might be growing. And I wondered if you could just expand on that, as well as your recommendation then that you do pursue a search for fields going forward. So if you could also share a little bit about that.
So when we did our first what fits part, we had to scale pieces of a lot of different fields. And high school fields are quite large. And even though the Buck site is quite large, it's actually fairly narrow. And so it was difficult to put certain size fields on the property because you still had to have a road that went through the property. And more importantly, there are major utilities under the property, and you cannot build fields on top of manholes. And so in order to move those sewer pipes, and one of them is 84 inches in size, and it would cost $10 to $15 million. So on top of the cost of the project or the property, it just didn't seem like a short-term solution. And if putting on top of that, it was also a former industrial site for a railroad, so it's certainly contaminated. So by the time you dealt with the contamination, the pipes, and the fact that they don't really fit easily, it just didn't. We did the final scenario. The best place is probably back the back by Hayes Park, and you could expand that, but that would still be an expensive project that would have to go through the CIP process. It's not impossible. Or you could acquire properties around the site over time and to expand it.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Dorsey?
Sure. I'd just like to pick up on what Mr. Weistad and Ms. Crystal talked about with the bus parking, which in some ways was kind of the straw that stirred the drink on a lot of these and trying to figure out where things would go. And I'm just curious as if you could elaborate a little bit more on the specific objections that people had with this, other than not being highest and best use, of which none of these really are. Getting at what was really driving the community concern, and then secondarily, if there was any conversation about ways that people have addressed this in other communities, because it's a common problem that lots of communities have had to deal with. So anyway, putting a lot on you to just determine the nature and tenor of the community conversation and objection to the bus issue specifically.
Well, there was a few things. First of all, they thought specifically that it was an underutilization of the property, that it's a parking lot, that it's a lot of pavement. So there was a lot of folks sort of view this property, which is situated between Washington and Lee and Hayes Park and Science Focus, as a corridor for schools, or it has the potential for something greater. And bus parking was not in that kind of vision, right? So that's one thing. But the specific objections to bus parking had a lot to do with light. So as you can imagine, if we have a hard time lighting fields, you can imagine lighting 120 buses to keep them secure at night. And so that would be a major consideration. Also the noise, because art buses and APS buses tend to leave early in the morning. Maybe it's not such an issue at other times, but and at night. So I think that it's the noise and the light, frankly. We did do our best to do a buffer. So if you look at the art bus parking on the Buck site, we tried to keep the buses away from the neighbors, but they're right up against it. So the Carlin Springs site, I think a lot of it is the traffic, frankly. There's terrible traffic especially at rush hour. We heard it over and over and over again. Staff agrees there's terrible traffic, so it didn't seem to be a very good place for buses. But also the environmental contamination, it's right next to a resource protection area. They also view that property as having a bigger, higher purpose because of the beautiful sledding hill, and it's just a nice site, maybe. So, does that help?
No, it does. Thank you.
I'm sitting here thinking this whole thing with buses, thank goodness buses don't have feelings. Let me go to Tanya first and then over to Reed.
Okay. So in Carlin Spring, first of all, thank you. It's great work. And I appreciate the presentation. It's excellent. Carlin Springs Scenario C, there is space for an APS, and I think you mentioned it would be elementary or middle school. Does that space include fields for that? Because I know we have green space that is for a park, DPR, but are we sharing that space with DPR, or is that the space that you allocated for schools include fields for middle or elementary?
One you're looking at, which?
Carlin Springs Scenario C.
Got it, yeah.
Yep. So when we started looking at schools, what we looked at was, essentially the footprint of the building, the potential parking, and the fields associated with the schools. If you look at the needs for middle school versus an elementary school, the footprint would be slightly larger from the field needs, but the building itself could be made taller. So we could have a larger school population that the middle schools would have, but keep approximately the same footprint for the building.
Okay.
I do want to mention that the subcommittees actually sort of looked at this a little differently. The Buck subcommittee always thought of the parking in Scenario C as sort of the temporary short term. Hopefully we'll find something else, because bus parking was never seen as a great option on Carlin Springs, and that a school would be planned and it could come later, but it would never be both. Like, you wouldn't put a school next to 120 art buses. It just never, that was never the plan. It was our discussion was buses for a while, transitioning to a school when the school was ready to decide what kind of school, and we dealt with the traffic, because I think we all went into this knowing that Carlin Springs has terrible traffic issues, and so it may not be it may not be the first one on a site for a new school.
Okay. So I have just two follow-ups on this, and just let me know if you need me to let someone else go. So just to be clear, we'd either have a space for school with parks, and before we get there, we would use it for bus parking, and it would give us time to find other bus parking or whatever. Would at any point what is currently cited as art bus parking, would at any point, would there be like the Office of Emergency Management across the street from the school? Or I'm just looking at the picture, like, are we going to be using that whole section if it's a school?
Well, really, what we decided was there were so many other planning processes happening that it was mostly our swing space, land bank, let's wait to see how things go scenario, that it would be very hard to specifically plan
Perfect.
it right now.
That's
but that
very
it could be
helpful.
used for short-term uses, surface uses, no high investment uses, and that it could be a school.
Okay, perfect. So with that, and I don't know if this is for our county board or for you, guys, but I noticed that in Buck Scenario C and Buck Scenario A, there's a couple of places where we have APS or the office management. And as a school board member, I would love to have everything that says APS for APS. Because I feel we're just in a lot of need for space right now. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that we have an office of emergency management that you guys need. And I'm trying to figure out where is your priority? Like if we were able to say, okay, we're going to move forward with Carlin Springs Scenario C and Buck Scenario C or Buck Scenario A, would we really have ability to have all three of those spaces without jeopardizing a county need? Because I don't know where your priority list is.
Yeah. And I don't think we can answer it. I think part of the discussion now is trying to sift out some of these questions so people hear them, and that as we choose those to get further analyzed, that would probably be what they'd be looking at.
Okay, great. And so I just want to make one final statement on the traffic study for the Carlin Springs. I'm the liaison to Kenmore Middle School. I'm also the liaison to the Glen Carlin Civic Association. And it's so imperative. We really need to figure out a way to address that. So as we move forward, however we move forward, we really need to do something with the pedestrian situation. I don't know if we do pedestrian bridges. I don't know what the answers are. I know we're advocating for crossing guards, but whatever we can do to help address our immediate needs. And then when we move forward, if we move forward with these sites, we can really be in a good place to help the community, support the community. I think that they really need that. So I wanted to put a little pitch in for that.
Good points. Reed?
Thank you. I know this is going to sound crazy, but the subject of my comments and questions is not about bus parking. So, get ready. This set of questions is about timing. And so let me ask about the Buck property first. I'm not exactly sure who to ask this question of. Realistically, when will the Buck property be ready for development by APS, assuming that we're doing something there, which I think we are all assuming that. So there's going to be several steps. JFAC's going to do their next step, what should fit. There's going to be a purchase. There's going to be a determination of use. We're going to need some bond funding. There's going to be construction. What time frame are we really looking at before we can, have students sit in permanent spaces there? Roughly.
I'm going to turn to the manager, or to Jennifer.
So let me walk you through a few things that are known, and I think a few things that aren't known, which is that on the timeline, we would, if the county board chooses to exercise the option, the property comes into our possession at the end of November of this calendar year. And then if there were to be, I think your question was about, let's say there was going to be a school, some sort of school building or school facility there, all the steps that I think that Ginger and Greg talked about, which were mentioned by Ms. Fioretti, which include an archaeological assessment, a environmental assessment, traffic assessment would have to happen. And those are at least probably 9 months, I'd say 9 months to a year before you have a final conclusion on that. And then there would have to be, if you're using the current space, the current building there, those buildings require some rehabilitation of some kind. And I think that would take a period of time. I can't speak to how long that might take. The buildings have a solid foundation. They're not falling down, but they require some interior work and renovation, so at least 6 months to a year there. So I'd say before you could actually move anybody in, and assuming the school board decided on what kind of program would happen, you're at least looking at least 3 to 4 years out before it's actually occupied by kids in a learning environment. Now, that's my estimate. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Jennifer's agreeing with you. All right.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask the same question about the Carlin Springs site. Let me actually back up, and I should have said thank you to both you, to all of the JFAC members and community members and the staff who have been involved in getting us to where we are today after only 6 frenetic months. So thank you all for this. So on the VHC site, and I'll get to the timeline question in a second, but there's, as Tanya mentioned, there's a lot of traffic and pedestrian safety improvements that we're going to need before more students are crossing the road in either direction. So we investigated that site for some of our high school options, and it was determined that because the traffic and the pedestrian safety improvements are not there now, we can't go forward with, high school seats there. And I'm not sure who's on first here. Are you planning on fixing that situation? Are you waiting for us to say that's a high priority for us and therefore we need it done sooner rather than later? So if you can walk me through the steps necessary to, produce or develop traffic and pedestrian safety improvements there, I'd appreciate it. On my next question.
No, that's all right.
This is going to be an essay answer.
So there's, I think it's called a transportation safety analysis, which we're committed to doing, which is, I would say, one of the more, I don't want to say it's straightforward, but it's the easiest piece of this, though it's not easy to do. The kinds of transportation options that you look at are ways to try to reduce some of the single occupancy vehicle traffic. But from what little I know, and we have transportation staff here that can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of that traffic is coming from outside our jurisdiction. So we could have lots of incentives if we wanted to convince Arlington residents to behave differently. We have a lot of pass-through traffic from Fairfax County. We have, which is a real problem. And so some of the other transformation that would need to take place, those roads are packed and busy, would require really substantial kinds of adjustments, whether it's, and I'm not saying we would do it, but it might include increasing the size of the right-of-way and easements and purchases of property. Those are quite considerable. I think they could, and we can do anything we want there as long as we've consulted with the community. We have the funds and we've laid it out, but that's a multi-year, I think that's a multi-year process. That's the best I could say for that. So at least 5 years into the future before you realize some of the more substantial kinds of improvements.
And then do we add on to that the answer you gave for Buck, that with the archaeological analysis and the bond funding and the construction and everything else, that it really wouldn't be ready for student use for another 5 years beyond that? 4 years?
At this point, I know I'll be wrong, so I'll simply say what's going to be wrong, which is that it probably wouldn't be another 5 years, but it would be a few years.
I would just, the only question I have to throw in is these are good questions. It's hard, I think, for anyone around the table to answer them, because it's sort of a what comes first, the chicken or the egg. What are we designing a road for? Yeah. It's almost that planners have to step back and figure out whether you do some feasibility analysis first. Is it possible to create a road without going and getting all the vacations and the easements? And because it might change if it were bus parking, or if it were an emergency communications center, or if it were a middle school, or if it were an elementary school. Those, and what might be on the Kenmore site as well. So what is a priority? So its first question might be feasibility, but you don't get into the rest of it to actual, detailed design or purchase or implementation until, be ashamed to go through all that and then decide we don't need a particular facility there. So these are a number of questions that are a little bit chicken and egg that I think staff and planners have to think through, and JFAC probably has to help us think through a little bit further.
Sure, but the urgency here is the relentless enrollment growth curve. And, as you saw, we're going to need 2 to 4 elementary schools, 1 to 2 middle schools, and a high school in the near to medium term. And so that's basically the
near term. So that's part of the issue. I think that has to be fleshed out. Are we talking about 5 years that we need 4 elementary schools, or is it in 20 years we need 3 elementaries. Those are the questions yet to be determined, right?
Right, but the urgency is there. And so we need to know, as we're looking at the development potential of these sites, what time frame are we really looking at? What problems can be solved in this term and then in that term?
Okay. Actually, James, can I ask a question first? I'm sorry. Can I go to the scenarios? And I'll just say up front, I think the recommendation on C is, I like it. I'm good with, I don't know if it's time to take a head nod on that one, but we're getting a lot of questions around C, which probably leads me to believe people are kind of gravitating towards C, and that's where the JFAC sort of gravitated. The question I have more is around A, the Carlin A, and that is that the JFAC recommended both Cs and one A. So if you did A, what does that mean? You're pairing that up with what? With the Buck C, and then where is that lovely everyone wants bus parking?
I do think that the hope of the group would be that there would be some other option.
I'm sorry.
I think the hope of the group that there would be some other option that's not on the table.
Okay,
Either an outright purchase of Shirlington Road or a different something. So
Okay.
there was a lot of discussion.
Because I know you all spent a lot of time thinking about bus parking in a way that, nobody in this, we just never have as a community, and it's hard, and it's not something that's desirable. So can I, actually, I'm going to turn to the manager on this one just briefly, and it'll dovetail with what Ginger just said, is there are 3 sites that are laid out as potential for bus parking. Buck, which is in a scenario or 2, but not recommended for further discussion. Carlin Springs, which is seen as short-term, even in the best of cases. And then there's the site in Shirlington, which wasn't really analyzed, but it was only analyzed as a surrogate almost with the Arcland site. And JFAC doesn't really like the Arcland swap. So if you could just tell us, to the degree you all shared this with JFAC or it influenced them, what are your priority sites? In other words, what would be the optimal site for bus parking from an operational standpoint?
From an operational standpoint, given that we have a number of our dispatch facilities and some of our other art bus parking located on East Street, some in the southern part of the county, having the art bus parking as close to that as possible, which means essentially my preference, and I think staff's preference, is the Shirlington site. And of course, I'm leaving out the fact that there's difficulty getting there. The Shirlington site is what we're using right now, and so that's already been integrated into our operations. And even the Carlin Springs site, which is something that we would make work if we had to, has the same issues about traffic that you all have spent a lot of time focusing on.
So if you were to prioritize them, your preference would be Shirlington, your second choice would be, I don't know, didn't you say? You didn't even say.
I actually didn't say I had a second choice, I think.
All right, okay. Sounds like you and JFAC, all right? Okay.
And if I could add, Mr. Schwartz, operationally, our existing and our planned heavy maintenance facilities are easily accessed by the Shirlington Road site. So in many ways, that is an ideal, if you were to actually design this without trying to figure out what neighborhoods are going to think of it, given all of the other existing pieces, that would be about where you'd place it on a map. Is that not right?
It's very close to 395, and the heavy maintenance facility we're looking at in Fairfax County has easiest access to that, though that's not a primary consideration. And for rollout, and again, given its location, and I would say the apparently universal acclaim from the 4 Mile Run Valley Working Group about how that would be acceptable to those stakeholders, that makes it also attractive.
And if I could just add, Mr. Fizette, because I'd like to be the Lorax here and speak for the buses for a minute, because I think they've gotten a real bad rap tonight. And I welcome anyone to join me on a tour of some of the, WMATA bus depots that are around. These really can fit
This is
very
our
well.
Metro representative, Christian Dorsey.
But, I don't want to give anyone the impression that we're looking to dump anything down in the Knox, Shirlington area. This can be something that very much exists well within a revitalizing area that's looking for, planned future development. And I think that working group has realized that this can be a very compatible use. I am not saying this to have other neighborhoods embrace and welcome the concept of bus parking, but I do want our community not to fear it. It's not an evil thing that's going to, completely, I think, disrupt the way people live their life.
I'm gonna, Okay,
I
go
just
ahead,
want to
and then
make sure
over to
nobody
James.
loses track of something that our county manager just said, which is the heavy maintenance facility in Fairfax, where it currently lives, where we're looking to site a new one. And I know this comes up a lot in the community. Why can't you meet some of these facility needs outside the county? I just wanted to make sure that that comment wasn't lost. We're doing that wherever we can.
right, and that's a very different thing than daily storage in and out. This is where you send a bus to go get some serious medical attention. Mr. Lander.
Thanks for the reminder, Mr. Dorsey. You're my representative on WMATA. I live off of Glebe Road, and the buses travel way too fast up and down. I'll send you an email, preferably.
I have an email that you can send that complaint to, and you'll let me know if you haven't heard back in 6 months, okay?
Well, I'll make sure I send it at 2 a.m. so that you get it right on time. My question is, of course, the obligatory thank you, but we've said thank you many times as an ongoing process. With the recommendation of scenario C at the Buck property, my question has to do with the discussion or the amount of discussion with potentially APS doing work across the street. And so instead of labeling it the Buck property, I'll label it the Quincy Street project, because you'll have construction theoretically of some type going on across the street from one another. Does that impact, or how does that impact the scenarios of bus parking and any other potential usage as you
The
have
Buck site?
at the Quincy site? Because I say that because utilization may be altered given what scenario the schools did. So if you could just discuss what that conversation is, because as the schools look to make a decision on high school secondary seats Thursday and begin discussion about how many seats and where, that may impact what scenarios potentially for utilization across the street. And so how, if any discussion has been had, that would be helpful.
So I'd say probably the way that they would connect the most is through the transportation, in terms of how many trips are generated. And scenario C actually would be, on the Buck site, would be fairly low impact. There would be almost no, everything is fairly quiet, not too many trips. So if we could coordinate those studies, that would be ideal, and we did recommend that. In terms of the construction phasing, and I can't answer that. But.
Right, and so my projection is there's scenarios looked at just on the Buck side of the street. The schools will be looking at utilization on the other side of the street. And if school bus or heavy maintenance vehicle parking becomes an issue at that point in the county, it may benefit us collectively to maximize the site by doing some type of renovation or construction that allows for more aesthetic parking, so vehicles aren't visibly seen from the street. You talked about safety and things like that. There's a garage there. That site has a lot of potential depending how far we want to invest. And so as we, and I know this will be next steps, but as we look at scenarios, I look at C and think to myself, if we add in what the schools are doing, what that impact may be long-term, and that may be discussion for later on.
I think a lot of the uses that we were considering, the fire vehicle storage, all of that would be in the warehouses, for one. And those are really expensive.
But school bus parking wouldn't be. I mean, that would be something we could
And
make space for.
I think there will be adjustments, and I think, but I think that it would probably be, a lot of those uses would be fairly compatible because they don't generate a lot of vehicles. A lot of the storage is inside. They're fairly quiet, and we've included a lot of pedestrian paths if possible, so we can get the community through the site. So I just,
Yeah,
that help?
I think what we will do is when we get to next steps and we start talking, we can play out potentially how, because you apparently hadn't gotten that far down the road. I think for the county and the schools, the question is, how do we maximize the site where maybe we do something on the Buck site that we would have done on the school side, which offers swapping of services back and forth, since there'll be construction to the whole neighborhood. You want to maximize the time that you invade people's neighborhood with dump trucks, right?
Got it. I know there are a couple more people that want to be recognized, and I'm just going to draw our attention to the clock, just so we have time, at the end to have some conversation on items 5 and 6, and we really have to tie this up. There are a couple other quick questions. If you have questions, great. If you can focus them around whether you have, and let us know what you like about C or whether you're comfortable with going forward with C, and then we'll have to talk about the other piece of the recommendation from JFAC.
I don't particularly have a question, although I think everybody else has said thank you to JFAC and to the staff and everybody. And I'd forgotten it was just 6 months. Wow. So anyway, thank you all very much. I'm sure you've had a good time together, I hope. And I'll just be really quick. I am fine with with your recommendations, except that I am very interested in the Arcland swap in some way or other, because I think we really need that land in Shirlington. So I'd like to keep that open, and so maybe there's some negotiations, some things that can make people more comfortable with it. However, but we need that land in Shirlington. I think the manager spoke to that pretty clearly. So that's my major issue, and otherwise I'm fine with things. The only other thing to consider is that the Office of Emergency Management, it's my understanding, can go just about anywhere easily. And there's some other things that can't just go about anywhere easily that might go here. So I'm a little leery of taking some of this great space that might be fairly specialized and using it for something that can go anywhere. So that was my only other caveat.
Thank you,
That's
Libby.
it.
That's helpful. I'm going to turn to John, and I'm going to look for kind of a head nod around option C and C.
I'm certainly fine as well with studying both Buck and Carlin Springs C, with the footnote for Carlin Springs C that, I don't know that one site can sustain both APS and ART bus parking at the same time. But another question on the Carlin Springs site, regardless of the scenarios we're talking about here, and that is, on one hand, we're saying with respect to the Buck site that we want to reuse and repurpose, at least in the short term, existing structures. But on the Carlin Springs site, I don't think anybody is suggesting that there's any way that we can practically repurpose or reuse the Virginia Hospital Center site. Is that correct? Okay, thanks, Ms. Fioretti. So my question is, at the same time, there are a lot of important uses right now on that VHC site. You've got everything from an eyeglass exchange to an emergency care center, a pediatric care center, a crisis call center, and child care. And we realize that there's a mandate that the hospital is going to have to find a new emergency care center somewhere in South Arlington. But what considerations did JFAC give to the timing and ultimate move out for VHC? And of course, we haven't taken the site yet. So if there's anything that could be said there, but either by JFAC or the manager, as to the practical considerations if we do go forward with the VHC site, what happens to those uses?
Okay. Do you want to go first, Ginger, and then if there's anything left, or Greg?
Yeah. In terms of the hospital site, yes, the building there is substantially older than the buildings we've been looking at the Buck site. So the lifespan and there's limited benefit to additional investment in that building. And as you noted, the hospital in its agreement has agreed to relocate the emergency center somewhere else in South Arlington. Our understanding is that they're also interested in relocating some of the other services. So for example, the pediatric center, the child care center. So a number of those uses would find new homes. VHC is likely to find new homes for them. And in terms of the timing, Mark, do you want to talk about the timing of the acquisition?
Musical chairs is what we're doing.
So what is going to come before the county board in July under the option agreement with Virginia Hospital Center is you'll be asked, given that the way the option agreement is structured and the Virginia Hospital Center has received their certificate of public need, you'll be asked to weigh in on the question of whether you're interested in swapping the property at Edison for the property down in Carlin Springs. The actual, the Virginia Hospital Center then is going through a process where they've submitted, will submit a site plan for consideration. That site plan will go through our site plan review committee and through the Planning Commission, and is likely to come before the county board in the fall of this year. And if the county board were to act to approve, the earliest which Virginia Hospital Center could actually close on that transaction would be in June of 2018, a year from now. So that would be the time at which the actual swap itself would be consummated, and that would be the earliest that the county would actually get possession of the property in June 2018. One of the reasons why in the option agreement, Virginia Hospital Center asked for that the lead time on the notice is so that they have a year to try to go through the process of relocating some of those things they have there. So that was the basis for that, and that's we're in constant conversation with the hospital center about the steps they're taking to look at that.
Okay. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to suggest that I'm going to summarize what I think I'm hearing around at least one piece of direction to our staff. And if people disagree, please let me know.
But clarification
Sure.
on the county manager's point there. Given that we're going through the CIP process in 2018, and I know we tend to adopt it sometime in June, I know that this might be a site that we would want to be looking at as part of our CIP in the spring. So when you say June, is that going to fit with our thinking and planning on that point? You said June 2018, I think, right?
I said that's when the transaction would be consummated and we would get possession of the property.
It'll be understood well before that.
Yeah, we would know beforehand that it was coming to us, so we could begin to make plans.
Thank you.
Plan on it. So what I'm actually seeing in front of us, and again, JFAC's work's been great, is that what's driving a lot of this is that Bucksite C, which I think I'm hearing generally, both JFAC likes it, the board, what I'm hearing around the table, people like it because of its lower cost. It's really something that's, you're using a lot of the existing facilities as much of investment. They may still need investment, obviously. Flexibility and adaptability to meet some needs. So if we start with that and then you look at the sort of complementary Carlin Springs, I think that one is a little more vague, but it lays out at least that one option for bus parking if an alternative aren't bus parking, and then future scenarios, longer term options for both schools and a range of other possibilities as yet undetermined. So it strikes me that the direction we're giving is to pursue C for both of them. And then the question is whether we want to also throw in Carlin Springs A as well. And then I would add to that, I'll go back to the bus parking in Shirlington because it strikes me that nobody is saying they have what they think is a long-term sustainable place for the bus parking. The manager has identified Shirlington as the optimal location, and it strikes me that we should be both directing the manager to further investigate that question, and there may be a caveat or a footnote, which Ms. Garvey put out there, is you can't yet fully remove the Arcland option from the Buck site until you have a longer-term solution to the bus parking. So if that seems like enough. I think in the end, we're saying we'll take the JFAC recommendation to do more work on those 3 scenarios that you identified and sort of task the manager to do some additional legwork on the Shirlington site for bus parking.
So Jay, just speaking on behalf of the board, we support the scenarios, particularly C, which you've pointed out, as well as A, that include the possible school facilities use and field space. We support the JFAC recommendations that the county purchase the sites, and that we would really like staff to begin to work with APS staff to thoroughly study both the Buck and VHC properties for school facility, and obviously your needs as well. So we've come to that conclusion as well.
Yeah. Everybody good with that? So, Mr. Manager, you feeling pretty clear? And
Can I?
Mr. Chairman?
John?
I'm sorry, Mr. Lander. The only supplement I would make to that is to keep in mind what Ms. Talento said, and that I think that it's imperative that before, we got to think about the timing of this, but a traffic analysis and an entire traffic analysis has got to be done earlier rather than later for both sites, but especially for Carlin Springs, because I think that's the most traffic challenged of the 2 sites.
I was just going to bring up one of the things that I know we've talked about in our leadership meeting is the perception that the school staff hadn't been involved in this process. And so as we get these recommendations and the school board has had a chance to review it, I wanted to ask our superintendent or the facilities folks who were liaison to just provide feedback on their participation in this so that folks have a chance to hear from the school staff who actually were involved in the process. And we have that communication, but because county staff is a lot larger resource-wise than the schools, the perception was somehow we weren't fully engaged. So I don't know if, especially with the school bus parking in those scenarios, if that could be addressed from school participants. I know Zach was involved in that.
I'll just share that Zach Leonard was our liaison to JFAC and worked very closely. I also know that other staff, along with Assistant Superintendent John Chadwick and Lisa Stingle, were also connected with that. We have also dedicated a position in the past year's budget specifically for JFAC. My encouragement, I think, is that while I recognize there are transitions that are being proposed, I would ask that we look beyond the bus parking, and I think that's been identified here as far as I think we have very valuable resources that are extremely limited. And how can we best utilize those limited resources for some of the larger priorities that I think that are on our plate today? And I think we need to be creative in looking at alternative solutions for, I'm not minimizing the bus parking, but I think we need to seriously look at some alternative solutions based on some of the current pressures that we have on our plate.
Okay. Okay, we're going to move on. The other 2 bullets under 4, by the way, are should we do a space utilization study of the trade center? And should JFAC review the county staff assessment of bus parking options? And I think on both of those, everybody's good, right? The space utilization study, as I understand it from JFAC, is not to do something that would be done quick, not recommending something in the short term that might influence the use of the Buck or Carlin Springs sites, but sort of another way of saying, hey, that's where a lot of stuff happens. Is there a more efficient way to take advantage of that space? But it's a bit of a mid to longer term utilization study. Is that correct?
Yes, because I think it would have to go through the CIP. A lot of the improvements would have to, the design would have to get into the CIP, the money for this, and then also with the improvements. So I would say it's not going to be done or in the next couple of years. So.
Okay. Katie?
Just to react to that, I certainly don't want to stop the JFAC from studying something that the commission as a whole thinks is worthwhile, but I would say, and being cognizant of the superintendent's comments just now, this community is already sick of talking about bus parking. And so I do, right, and so I do wonder a little bit if, given some of the other things I know we're about to discuss, with longer-term thinking, with schools needs to 2040, with county needs to 2040, if the trade center utilization represents the best use of staff and JFAC time. So I might actually propose that rather than sort of validate that next step here, maybe the Joint Leadership Subcommittee continues to talk about that with the JFAC leadership and talk about whether that represents a trade-off with some of these other issues in the work plan, like the long-term vision for schools, parks, housing, that might feel more important to the community.
I'm okay with doing that. I mean, I think it's a really logical thing to do. I mean, it is where we put a lot of things. So my only question is how fast we do it, or do we put it off? And so to have that conversation with a little more discussion in a broader context of everything else that we're talking about doing is fine with me at this point. I think everybody is saying that it makes sense to do it. It's just we don't know what time. The last one is just, it's really a direction to staff as well, but it's allowing JFAC to be briefed and get a full update on the discussion about bus parking options in the county, outside the county as well. So now can we move on to 5? Discussion and direction to JFAC, in other words, giving some ideas of the things we'd like them to work on into the future. And I think there's quite a nice list of things. Why don't we start with Reed?
So actually, I'm going back to Katie's comment. And do we have a sense from the JFAC leadership about your bandwidth? I mean, can you assess sites for school needs and also review the county staff assessment of bus parking options and also, everything else that's going to come up in the next 20 minutes? What kind of bandwidth do you see?
Sure. I mean, I think some of it depends on exactly
The next 20 minutes.
but also how we set up the subcommittees. If we could bring in outside help from, our charter does say that we can bring in folks from the school's FAC, or we can bring in, so we can probably increase our capacity in that way. We'd have to take it back and think about it. But I think that there's ways that we can
Ginger, speak into that.
Sorry, I think there's ways we
in the back
can-
of the room.
I think there's ways that we can increase our capacity and also bring in some outside expertise from some of our, so.
Okay. All right, so discussion and direction. What are some of the things that we would like to see? And you may have some ideas of your own, which you've suggested to us. So you have some recommendations in here about what you'd like to take up next.
Our biggest recommendation, we've already discussed the Trade Center, but our biggest one is task the commission with developing a work plan to address the mid and long-term needs for schools and other community facilities.
Okay.
And Jay, I'll tell you that our board has discussed this, and we do support that recommendation. We really do need to, as we understand how complex the issues are going to be related to finding school space and triaging that with the other needs of the county, we really do want to begin the process of finding and looking at a framework for, and then assessing our needs, assessing a framework, finding the sites that we might. I know that sites is one of those words we have to be careful with, but finding possible locations for schools, that is a very high priority for us, and we'd really like that to happen together with the county facilities needs. We want to make sure, because part of your charge is to look at the assessing the needs and looking at forecasts and projections and really having a common language that we can share about our actual numbers of students and numbers of schools that we'll need. We want to do that with you. Do that together with our staff and the county staff, as well as the work of your committee. We think it's really critical that in every single site or location we look at, that as Mr. Weistad and Ms. Lento has said, that we have to look now at impact studies in every neighborhood regarding streets, sidewalks, traffic, pedestrian safety. And we would really like to get some recommendations by the 2019, if that's at all possible, because at that point, we really have to start to build our next CIP that will need to find locations for those next schools. And we know that it will take us longer because we will need to go through a community process as well as our own building process. So we just want to build in enough time to do that. So that would be our request.
Mr. Dorsey and Ms. Garvey?
Actually,
Oh, then Ms. Garvey, he just had his light on. Ms.
Just
Garvey.
has light on, yeah. So I like this idea too. As you do this, are you sure that when you look at both county and school needs, that the needs, we're going to be doing work the same way in 10 or 20 years that we've been doing it for the last 50? And that's something that I think JFAC could be really helpful with. I'm not sure you can seek out that information. You can't decide, but I'm imagining I'll open it up to my, yeah.
You mean?
What I mean is I assume, we look at all times different ways of delivering our services differently. I'm not sure how we might do them differently, but we might be with like for example, the streetlights, they're going to start to tell us when they're out and what they need. Maybe there'll be less need for lay down things because they'll like send the signal to Amazon and they'll fly it in by drone and put it in place. I don't know. But I think there may be that sort of thing, and I think some thought needs to be given to that so that we don't sort of fight the last war. And it seems to me in education particularly, there are a lot of changes that our school system has been doing some things sort of differently, but it may get, if it goes to scale, it really could change possibly how buildings are sited or what is needed in the buildings. And it seems to me that's something that some thinking that JFAC could do to us, rather than task them to go forward and plan to do things in the next 20 years the way we've been doing it for the last 50. I don't think that's as useful as asking them to do some thinking about how we're going to need that.
I think I understand what you mean now. How would JFAC operationalize that?
Well, I know that the schools have done a lot of work on thinking about the future of education. I think that there was a superintendent's group that did a lot of work. So I guess, so that would be one thing, would be to realize or think about what has already been done in that regard, but also to work with our wonderful professional staff, both of them, the schools and the APS, to think about those things as well. I have to give it some thought.
I think thinking through that and how you might operationalize it and think through it. I'm not questioning whether there's value in doing that. I don't know where it's done, if it's inside JFAC, if it's somewhere else and shared. But I think some more thinking about that is fine. What about the issue of preparing for the CIP next year? What do you see as your responsibility in terms of the charge to review input, provide input, et cetera? And then the other one is, I think Nancy just mentioned it, the demographics and the numbers to build on the community facility study and actually do an update that can provide numbers and that the best projections. We know projections are only projections, but the best projections that you can as we get into the next CIP. So you want to comment on that? Oh, John, you want to go?
Yes, I think, the first thing we would do is we haven't worked on those items over the past few months. And so the first thing that we would do would be to get our staff team together, if that's what you want us to do, and figure out how to do that. I think over the next couple of months, the commission won't be meeting, but Greg and I will be meeting with staff to kind of lay things out and come up with a work plan, and we can go back and discuss those questions and come back to you.
Okay, John, and then
Yeah.
Katie. Is that you?
Chair Van Doren, I appreciate your comments in endorsing the JFAC recommendation to address the mid and long-term needs for our schools. I'm very comfortable with that. I think, frankly, that in the future, we're going to have to look at maybe slowing down some things on the county side and given the dire need for more seats for more kids and speed things up on the school side and step back a little bit on our side. At the same time, I think we have an obligation on our side. One of the things that came out of the Joint Facilities Commission was a recommendation that we do a cost-benefit analysis or economic impact statement on site plan developments. And so we looked at that, our staff looked at that, and then our county attorney issued a memo saying, wait a minute, we really can't do that for certain reasons, and that's a confidential memo. I'm hoping that ultimately we're going to be getting to the point where you can see that memo as well, and the community can see that memo as to the apparent obstacles we're facing in doing a site-specific cost-benefit analysis. And if we can't do a site-specific cost-benefit analysis, maybe we can do it on a periodic basis. But I think that we need to be able to do more on our side so that you folks can anticipate better where this school growth is occurring and why it's occurring, and how we can manage that growth. And we're going to also have to start thinking about, okay, you know, do we upzone? Do we change the general land use plan for ever-increasing density? And there are going to be sites and perfectly good reasons to do it, but I think we need to we really need to come to grips with how we're growing as a community, where we're growing, when we're growing, and under what criteria we're growing, and what are we getting in return.
Okay, Reed.
Yeah, actually, John kind of said the substance of what I wanted to say, maybe in different words, but again, I wanted to use the word urgency, you know, from APS's point of view, again, because of the rising enrollment curve. As we're looking at next steps for long-term planning, I think we got to keep this in mind, that we are being driven by an urgent need, you know, based on this enrollment growth, and have to weigh that against, I know we need certain county facilities, but that urgency thing is particularly important for us.
Right. I'm going to go to Katie. The one thing I will say is that part of what JFAC will do, and with the demographers and all, is really help us all get a handle on what that is. And I say that because, you know, we're all getting, you know, mail, and we've gotten mail, and the numbers cited in that mail, you know, of 40,000 kids by 2035 is just not accurate, and nobody believes it's accurate, but somehow it's a perception of reality. So until we get some of that better data and better projections, it's really hard to know what the, you know, what the optimal growth will be, and where in the county, and how we integrate that with population growth and other community needs. Katie?
We just wanted, again, to commend everyone's attention to a document that I know we continue to go back to, which is the forecast and prediction methodology improvements presentation we received jointly in October of last year, just to speak to that concern about sort of, quote, not knowing where our students are coming from. And actually, we had really terrific external validation of analyses that do indicate to us exactly where our students are coming from, which is 75% coming from existing housing and another 12% coming from new single-family construction. And so I think as long as we're talking about what's generating our students' population, it's worth continuing to really immerse ourselves in that document. Just wanted to say on the topic of the long-range planning that I remain tremendously interested in that, and have had some great conversations with our counterparts on the school board about it, and wanted to add, I think one of the things that could be most helpful, what's really been sort of a stumbling block, I think, in our conversations, is trying to define short, mid, and long term. You know, I've used the term sometimes inside the CIP versus outside the CIP. You know, I know Mr. Goldstein talking about urgent, right? There's sort of that sense there are one or two, or I think maybe one after Thursday left, unsighted facilities needs within the school CIP, but maybe that's the most urgent, but there's certainly pressing long range up to 2040 needs. You know, on our side for the county facilities, and our manager referenced them, you know, the likely to be adopted open spaces up master plan calling for 10 acres, right, in the same time horizon as those 7 new schools. The nearly 23,000 committed affordable units that are part of our adopted policy vision. And that's sort of in that same time horizon. It's hard to articulate sometimes in those conversations. Well, what's midterm? What's long-term? This feels urgent, what is equally urgent? And so to the extent that JFAC and its expertise and wisdom can help us with that taxonomy and what we call the different time horizons, I think actually could be a really enduringly valuable contribution, even as we get outside of the individual siting needs.
Good. Ms. Cannon.
Yes. Jay, I do want to follow up on your comment, because I think there are probably people that are going to be watching the live stream and wrote letters saying with the 40,000 figure. So
there will be
want to
40,000 kids by 2035.
I do want to clarify, the number is actually not accurate. It's the number it refers to the number of 0 to 14-year-olds in the county. And I think what you meant by saying it's not accurate is that it's not actually the number of students that are projected.
No, what I said is what they wrote is inaccurate, because they wrote there will be 40,000 students
Okay, but
in the schools.
Yeah, but I want to make
that's
sure.
inaccurate.
Yeah, but people are watching, and I think it's fair to them to clarify that the number was presented as the number of children, 0 to 14, and not all of those children end up as students in our system. So, however, it is also the case in talking about the urgency that we are projecting, and I think, we've looked at how our numbers reconcile with the county estimate. That 40,000 was a county estimate of kids, and then our projections. And we do have, even in the 10-year time horizon, we're looking at over about 33,000, and as Mr. Goldstein has pointed out, that number does continue to go up in terms of our seat needs. So the question of urgency, in my opinion, is exactly what JFAC, what I understood when we set JFAC up in the first place, and when the community facility study recommended it. It's exactly to help us, our two boards, prioritize urgency. If JFAC is looking at your list, you have a 0 to 10-year list and a 10-year and beyond list. We have a 0 to 10-year and a 10-year beyond list of needs. And if we can only do some of them, how do we choose? And my understanding is that's exactly what we're charging this commission of citizens, who are all at large, to help us understand and to determine that urgency. They may say it's all buses. They may say it's, a lot of schools, but I think we should trust them to make that judgment for us, and then bring us that recommendation. As I really appreciate Mr. Weistadt's comment that it may mean slowing down things. It could mean slowing down things on either side. We haven't heard yet what their recommendation is on that, but I do hope that we'll all be very open to hearing from our citizen group onto how that urgency balances out across the different needs.
Mr. Dorsey?
Thank you, Mr. Facette. So, I want to just express that the urgency that we're hearing expressed from our school board colleagues, I don't take lightly. Obviously, we want to make sure that every child who is a student at Arlington Public Schools has access to a great quality education, of which facilities is a part of it. So there's absolutely no question about it. As we think about marrying the best capacities that the wonderful JFAC has with what is sensible moving forward, I think there are a couple of approaches just to throw out there, and I'm not saying that anyone is not doing it, but I think it bears reiterating. We can treat this urgency as an ad hoc exercise to just look at what we have on our current portfolio and what we're thinking about acquiring, and that is one way to think about it. I think there's a better way, which incorporates looking at future projections, looking at our goals for socioeconomic diversity in schools, looking at our existing transportation network, and trying to figure out where exactly we want our schools to be, even if it's currently not on a site that we control or that is part of JFAC's purview, because we have not talked a lot about, even though it's hard in a community like Arlington, we can acquire property. We've done it. And it's not to say that that's what we are absolutely going to do, but it is an option. And that should be an option that we consider if it's in the best interests of larger goals than just simply more seats. And I want to make sure that's really a part of the conversation, because as we think about long-term needs, I want to make sure that where we put school facilities and county facilities makes sense, and that we just don't have a patchwork of, a hand that somebody else dealt us. Moving forward, I think it really makes sense to be very intentional about getting the schools where we need them, the county facilities where we need them. In some cases, it's not going to be possible, and we're going to have to default to, well, how do we co-locate on something that we already have? That's okay, but I hope we just don't limit ourselves to that from the outset.
Okay, good points. Tanya?
Yes. I just wanted to make one final point. We're about to vote on 1,300 seats, which was approved in the CIP in June, to come online in 2022. That's a 6-year process. So every time we build something, it's about a 6-year process. So when we look at our CIP, right now, it says that in 2025, our expected enrollment is 31,000 students. And so however we looked at our CIP, we have to build in 6 years. And so I just want to reiterate, in the Carlin Springs site, if a traffic study and that impact and any infrastructure that you may have to support for that community, from whenever you do that, we're going to need 6 years to start building, just to start the process, to get it into our CIP. And we do our CIP every 2 years. So for us, the urgency is 20 years down the line, we're already, when we talk about 20 years, that's not working with time frame that we are preliminarily seeing right now. And so I just wanted to just reemphasize the stress of that I totally agree with. I would love a way to pick the sites and work with the community and work with tools that we have to figure out where we want to put county facilities and schools. But unfortunately, right now, I don't know if we have that luxury for what we're foreseeing in the immediate future when it takes us, as our process, 6 years to put something forth. And we are doing everything we can to be efficient, but engage the community, be responsible, make sure that we're providing every student that walks through our doors a seat. So I just wanted to remind you of that. And maybe we need to, in our leadership meetings, have more information on our processes so that you can support us and then we can support you and support our engagement moving forward as we look at growing our community both on the county and school site. Thank you.
Very nice. Okay, I think I'm gonna, did you have anything you wanted to add here? Okay, let me just make a comment at the end. The direction, I think we laid out a couple things, some of them sort of in your ongoing work around the CIP coming up. We heard a lot of discussion around the numbers and the clarifying, updating the numbers and the need. The framework, as far as the long-term, quote, long-term work, I think sitting down, as you've said, with planners to help design what that looks like that will be useful to all of us. And to me, that, I don't know how many months that will take, but create that framework that then gives us all some greater comfort and ability to know what that work plan essentially looks like. We've heard about somebody mentioned the short-term, mid-term, long-term. I think there are a lot of words that go out here. And what is short-term to some and mid-term and long-term, we probably don't all agree with. I know what I might say, but I think of the CIP that exists as mid-term. I know we both have a CIP. I mean, and the school CIP was designed a year ago to meet the school needs for 10 years, right? So the mid-term is maybe that CIP. Then there's long-term is beyond that, not in the CIP. The only other thing I'll throw in, because we got into the discussion of whose role is what, and I have a slightly different interpretation of JFAC's role, which maybe we need to clarify. I don't see JFAC's role as making the decisions about the prioritization. That is the county board's role. JFAC is assessing, analyzing, giving recommendations. The school board is identifying your needs or your priorities and then bringing that would help inform the county board's decision. Hopefully, nirvana is we're all in agreement. Everything sort of syncs together. But the reality is there are sometimes different roles because we just bear that responsibility for a very large portfolio of things. Schools, the good news is we all have the same kind of commitment to public education as proven by our incredible schools. That said, we have a lot of other needs that require balance, and my guess is we'll all work it out. If there is nothing more, incredibly useful, incredibly informative. I'm the only one that hasn't thanked you, so thank you. You and everyone here did a great job. We're adjourned.
Vacation.